let me start by just thanking everybody from both universities on this occasion. You know, obviously we're here at Liverpool Hope University for the next CCDS seminar, and this is the next one in the Disability Futurity series. And this particular series we have organised in collaboration with Carleton University in Canada. And on this occasion, as I say, we've got a link here directly with Carleton, so hopefully we can stay in contact throughout the seminar and into the questions that Claire's kindly agreed to answer. Just before we come to all of that, let me just say a few things about the series. The CCDS Disability Futurity series is sort of in many ways a natural development from the other project that we are involved with, the cultural history of disability. So it seemed that when we've been working on that, that there was the suggestion that we might think that predicated futurity, and hence the focus on disability futurity. There are a few people who I need to thank officially along those lines. Most obviously, Dr. Owen Barden, Dr. Claire Penker, and at Carleton, Dr. Ryan Patterson. Those are the three people in particular that have been working on that part of the project. And of course, in both universities, that extends much further than that. In particular, in relation to today, I must thank Amy Scott, who has put a lot of work in to get things sorted out for us here, and indeed my own support worker, Hardy Lightburn. And as things weren't quite what we expected here when we arrived, everyone sort of got on and helped. So there's a much bigger list of people who ought to be thanked. In particular, again, I should mention Brian from IT, who's got involved relatively late in the day and managed to sort out this link. So lots of people to thank as ever. Let me just be more specific now around the content then. So I've talked about the way in which the Disability Futurity grew out of this cultural history project that we're working on primarily with George Washington University, but again, lots of other universities are involved in that. We can talk about that more another time. Specifically today, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Claire Penker, who is Associate Professor and Head of the Department of Disability and Education. She's going to give a paper that's very engaged with the topic. As ever, she's really taken hold of the theme and dug deep into that theme and done some really good stuff with it. I've talked to her about this, and it's really exciting work. So this is one of many seminars that Claire's done for the CCDS. She's also got a couple of books to her name. Disability Avoidance in the Academy is one that's actually based on a CCDS event, and then her own monograph, A Clumsy Encounter, which goes back a few years now, but is an interesting book that students are often engaged with on the courses we deliver here and so on. So those are a few things I would straight away say about Claire. But today, in particular, then it's art education and disability futurity subjects on the edge, and that's going to be the focus of this seminar. So I think the best thing I can do really is just get out of the way and let Claire get on.
I don't know why I was just going to grab this banana. It's inappropriate. Okay, so I wanted just to start by saying thanks for coming. It's really nice, nice to have a room of people And hello, everybody over there. Oh, good. So that's great. So we've got people in the room and outside of the room, which is super. Yeah, so a heartfelt thanks then for everybody who's come to listen to this. I'd also just like to say thanks to David for continued work in leadership on CCDS and for enabling us to engage with these seminars, with the conference that we've got coming and all of that activity. And I think in any kind of organisation where you can have a sustained attempt at engaging, it's very, very important that we can keep those things going, and that's worked well. I do want to say a few words just about the slides. So I've got just some very, very simple slides, but there is a background image to the slides which might run a little bit of interference. So I just want to talk about that very briefly. The slides were based on a piece of art practice. I would describe it as art practice, where I was engaging with the broad areas of need from our special educational needs code of practice. Within the code of practice, we have 4 areas of need that basically use deficit language to describe problems that children might have in their education. I was very interested in the way that these ideas dominate our discourses in education, and the art practice here was around quite a literal approach, actually, around binding those broad areas of need, thinking about ways that those could be bound, and also using retraction, so thinking about how some of the language would be retracted and some of those ideas would be rewritten. So it isn't, those aren't directly relevant to the presentation, but I've used them as a background, and I think it's important to recognise that pervading discourse that we're working with, particularly when we're working in the area of formalised compulsory art education, that when art education meets disability, it is within the framework of that special education discourse. So that was just a few words just about the slides. I do also just want to recognise that my work within the department is obviously informed by disability studies, but I'm an arts educator originally. My background is in art education. So I'm a member of the National Society for Education in Art and Design, and also INSEA, which is the International Society for Education through Art and Design. I'm also joint co-editor of IJADE, which is the International Journal of Art and Design Education. And I just make those things known so that we can just make some connections there, particularly for people, our international colleagues. So, having said all that, I'm about ready to go, I think. I've structured the talk in 5 parts. So part 1, arguments and definitions. Part 2, a word about futurity. Part 3, plural histories of art education and disability. Part 4, I move to the idea of subjects on the edge. Part 5, concluding with dystopian and utopian futures. And I thought it's useful sometimes to structure in this way. If you're flagging a bit and you know that we've got to part 3, then you know we're on the downhill, and it helps you just maybe to think through where we are. So I'll move first of all then to arguments and definitions. I am going to largely read this paper, and I will maybe come out of that at various points, but it's just worth noting that I will read this predominantly. So, part 1, arguments and definitions. This paper stems from work on a larger project that aims to explore parallel histories of art education and disability in England, more particularly from around 1830 and until the present, although obviously this work on futurity takes us beyond. And it's informed by that Foucauldian genealogical approach, looking at the emergence of discourses in those areas. My argument, one of the arguments that I'm going to present, is that histories of art, education and disability are and have been read separately. And I propose that, those histories have been read separately. I propose a plural reading, therefore, to enable a comprehensive understanding of the emergence of false separations that are contradictory to art's future capacities to educate. So the argument basically is around this separation, which I'm arguing is it's an unfruitful separation. It's an artificial separation that has been reinforced throughout historical ideas. Now, I do want to just talk a little bit about the idea about definitions, particularly as we're talking about this move from history through to present and the future. And the idea that we've got these flexible, constantly shifting sets of definitions that we're working with. Ideas about what has been, what is now, are vital in our exploration of what might come to be, past, present and future. The past appears solid, confirmed and established. Our present is shifting and future always uncertain, although we know that the past is just as uncertain a place as the future. Definitions of art education and disability are understood in our present context. We look back and project from our current situation. An evolution of art education can be read with and through moments that shift our understanding of disability. And I'll use the example here of Marxist readings. For example, they would acknowledge the significant influence of capitalism on the production of art education. And we can make very direct connections here with foundational work in disability studies by Michael Oliver, recognising the significance of social and material conditions for the creation of disablement. So we've had this shared history. And I would say actually that the idea around the influence of capitalism on our compulsory formal education is something that runs throughout this presentation. This moment, an elusive now, our present always, slipping into a future, frames our definitions and conceptualizations of what has been and what can come to be. There can be a danger then of imposing present definitions and ethical and moral judgments on a very different past. And this might limit our conceptualizations also of what we can become, because we're unable to imagine a world that differs very significantly from our own. So think about then our three terms here, or ideas that I want to work with: art, education and disability. And these three ideas have been defined in very different ways over time. So art, we might think about making, fine art, drawing, painting, craft, technical training, spiritual growth, morality, usefulness, individual creativity, well-being, colouring in. Education could be about learning, societal good, personal freedoms, liberation, neoliberal productivity, regulation, competition, control. And disability, we can think in terms of impairment, personal tragedy, being socially produced, related to identity, imposed, regulated, dis/ability, concerned with ableism. As definitions have shifted, so too have the relationships between these three different elements. So on the board here, I've got the main arguments, but also then art plus education plus disability. We could have a different sum. Art plus education can equal disability. But we might also think about disability arts equaling education. And I just want to set up that idea about the range of different definitions and how those might emerge over time. So I'm moving now to part 2 to think a little bit about this word futurity, a word about futurity. And I've got a quote on the slide which I will read. I'm coming to that after I've proposed the discussion. So future may be perceived of as this distant sci-fi future, barely recognisable utopian or dystopian dream worlds that sit beyond our understanding and beyond our control. And actually I was conscious about this with my rather dull slides, that they were working with this sort of dystopian grey future that we might all be lurching towards. But the future is also more immediate. And I wanted to think about this nature of futurity. It is the now and now and now. So we always are working in and stepping into this idea of the future. And this more immediate grasp on the future might give us more control in terms of thinking about our agency. This acknowledgement that our future is always within the present and moving slightly beyond, but with that present is important. So futurity, I want to just spend a moment exploring the idea of futurity, a future time, hinting at our continued existence. Humans have a predisposition towards the future, fortunately. Some call it planning, others might just refer to it as thinking. I'm going to introduce work now by Franco Bifo Berardi from the book And, Phenomenology of the End, to help us to think about futurity. And Berardi draws on work by Deleuze and Guattari, who in their metaphor of the rhizome reject notions of the beginning and the end. They suggest that we are always in the middle of something, where to be is supplanted by a continuity, and. Berardi then refers to the future as imminent, that it's contained in the now. We're concerned then with what the present reveals about the future. And I'll go to the quote on the slide now. The future, he says, is inscribed in the present structure of the world as a range of possibilities, as a tendency that we can imagine, sense, and perceive, although we cannot clearly see it. Prophecy, indeed, is a sort of premonition, a vibratory sense of intuition that gives us the possibility of feeling the future as tendency. The present state of the world can be described as the vibratory occurrence of many possibilities. How will chaotic vibration give birth to the event? Why is it, among all possibilities of development, one of them prevails? Why is it, among all possibilities of development, one of them prevails? And I want to take that now into exploring some histories of art education, to think about that idea about futurity and why it is that particular trajectories take hold and others maybe don't. Is everybody all right?
Yeah.
Is everybody, are you all right over there?
Yes. Yeah.
Brilliant. Good to know. So part 3, and this is a slightly lengthier section now, relating to histories of art education and disability. And again, the argument here is that disability has been occluded, is largely absent from histories of art education. And this is a problem, I would argue, if we want to think about art education and disability futurity. Our educational imagination has been reduced by the exclusion of body minds that might have shaped the landscape of art education. And I'd argue that this is a very real consequence of our segregated education system. The removal of particular body minds from our thinking about art and education. Histories of art education suggest that we fail to take account of what Mitchell, Snyder and Ware refer to as peripheral embodiments. And I'm taking that term from their work on the biopolitics of disability. An art education historian, Mervyn Romans, wrote that there were 5 key histories of art education, and these offer a corroborative and entrenched view of the emergence of art education from early fine art academies and design schools. Romans argued for a revision of this history, yet still fails to take account of disability, And the 5 key histories that he refers to are Clive Ashwin's work in 1975, which referred to policy from the 1700s all the way through to 1975. Quentin Bell's work on design schools, Richard Carline, Draw They Must, Gordon Sutton's work in 1967, and Stuart MacDonald's work on philosophy and history of art education in 1970. And obviously just hearing those dates, we can see that work is taking place in the 60s and early 70s. And it's problematic that we've got this reification of a particular history of art education. And I think this is evident in Ashwin's introduction in 1975, when he writes about his rationale for the collection that he's put together. He says this book provides a collection of edited extracts from documents which relate to the development of art and design education in Britain, with commentaries on the contents of the documents and their historical context. And then he goes on to say documents have been selected for inclusion on the grounds of their relevance to the development of art education. Now, obviously, as historians or as academics, we always are selective about what we do. But I think that's a really useful articulation of this idea about material being selected for particular relevance. And we can see then that this idea about history is formulated through those selections, but also through what's omitted. Histories of art education and disability are written, but these are parallel rather than intersecting. I've argued elsewhere that a plural reading reveals intersections and influences that might otherwise be ignored. The occlusion of disability history from histories of art education results in the emergence and reinforcement of art education as a system of ableist practices. A bold statement which many art educators might take us to task on, but we'll put it out there for now anyway. So I'm going to take a particular example now of the emergence of formalised art education in England during the early 19th century. The shared history of art education and disability is very clear in what I'm describing as this mid-industrial age. Michael Oliver identifies the Industrial Revolution as key in producing conditions for disablement. This corresponds with a significant time in the evolution of art education. Capitalist industrialisation forms the defining context for art education and disability. At the beginning of the 19th century, art and design education was a central concern at the level of governmental intervention. It's really very difficult to comprehend anybody who's working in the arts more broadly and in art education specifically, the marginalisation, which I'll talk to later. But to think that at this time that there were government committees that were set up to address the centrality of art, design and craft education. So it was a very much a central concern because of industrialisation, because of technical production and manufacture. So at the beginning of 19th century, we saw this great influence in terms of governmental control, in terms of art education. Art education in fine art academies was recognised as having limited influence on design and manufacture. At this time, and as a result of perceived market demands, the emphasis started to shift from fine art academies into manufacture and design schools. Art and design education began to emerge as ocular-centric in prioritising particular forms of vision and visuality. Now, we could obviously argue that prior to that, there's a long history in terms of fine art traditions, which would suggest that vision and visuality has been central to all kinds of fine art practice, going back, well beyond sort of 1830. But I want to say a little bit more about the role of vision, ocular centricity, and ocular normativity that started to take hold within that design education. So just to say a little bit more about this. A concern with poor quality design in England and the potential threat from superior European designs gave rise to an increased interest in the need to formalise art and design education for future makers, but also for consumers of design. We can't help but just note the irony of this constant relationship that we have with Europe. And this, don't mention Brexit. I won't. It was one of those words that I should have said I wasn't going to mention. However, French and German design work was heralded as superior and from a superior set of traditions. As a result, art and design education was recognised as being of national importance, with an emphasis on the need to move towards high quality design. The method and approach for achieving this was defined by working from nature and applying this to manufacture, and resulted in a significant emphasis on working from direct observation and on this idea of good drawing. In 1836, in the report of the Select Committee of Arts and Manufactures, Henry Sass, teacher of art and painting, reported that the basis of art and design is the delineation of objects through geometry, arts, and perspective. Perspective was described as being of particular importance since its principles can never be too scrupulously observed, this is a quote, to deviate in any case is to violate natural propriety and sacrifice to a fallacious pretext of taste the certainty of truth and science. So just to say, this alignment with vision, visuality, the idea around sight, truth, and knowledge, knowledge of God, knowledge of nature, all of those things we saw coming through in the work of John Ruskin, for example, but this was very much embedded in this art tradition. Art manufacture and science were given equal status at the time, not, very, very different to the situation we're in now. So ocular centricity then gives way to ocular normativity, and I make particular use of David Bolt's concept here, since an art and design education without vision emerges as incomprehensible and beyond the cultural imagination. So that was one reading from those 5 texts around art, design, craft education around that time. But I want to then look at this parallel history and consider a little bit of local history. So consider now then some local history of the Royal School for the Blind, which was established in 1791 as the Liverpool Asylum for the benefit of the indigent blind. It offered a place for technical training, so predominantly that was a place for training for adults. Liverpool at the time had a massive growing population. There were real issues in terms of poverty, poor conditions for industrial classes. There was an influx of people from Ireland as a result of famine and oppressive regulation through the Corn Laws, and a recognition that an infrastructure of support, training and education was required. So we see from 1791 up to, as I'm saying, I'm talking now around 1830, this growth and development in institutions to support the poor, but also educational training institutions. By 1830, the curriculum of the Royal School was heavy with technical manufacture and craft work designed for adult education, described as worthy work that replaced begging and allowed the blind, in quotes, to contribute to the production of trade goods. So again, we can see the emphasis on design and technical training that was then leading art education out of the art academy into design and technical training was also evident in the curriculum for the Royal School for the Blind. But I've questioned, what do we know of the work produced there? There have been some archival projects which have sought to explore the work that was produced within the school, which I'll refer to. According to the recent Histories of Place project, craft work dominated in the Royal School for the Blind as a means of occupation. And this is to quote, to forget the handicap of useless eyes. Craft, as the poor relation in art, craft and design, emerges then as busy work for docile bodies, although there is evidence that art, craft and design work produced in segregated settings was exhibited and valued. So, for example, Robbins, writing in 1885, reported in the American Annals of the Deaf and Dumb on the quality of exhibits of deaf mutes made at the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition in New Orleans. So I think it's too problematic to say that the work was dismissed at the time. Probably the work was taken account of. And again, this is an attempt to further my argument, although those histories and that work had a particular place, when we think about the development of a history of art education, those histories tend to be lost or occluded by these dominant histories. But I would say the institutionalisation of disabled people, in this case, reinforces the separation of art, craft and design along the lines of able/disabled, elite fine art, design/manufacture and occupational craft. Those making a productive contribution defined as central to the country's economic pursuits, whilst others are engaged in remedial busy work. So, part 4, I'm going to move now to subjects on the edge. So if we can just get our heads out of the 1830s, back in the room, the phrase I'd use here is, how do we bring this past to the future without a DeLorean? And I don't know if I have to explain that joke, but I don't. Some people laugh, so that's okay. Futurity then requires us to take account of the present so we can return to our trilogy of art, education and disability. So I'm just bringing us back into our current situation now, before I go move into this conclusion where I'm thinking about dystopian and utopian futures. So we have our words here, our ideas, art, education and disability, and Berardi's vibratory concurrence of many possibilities, with a continued emphasis on capitalist means of production and consumption that impact on our definitions of all three. So I'm saying basically this, the dominance of a capitalist ideology has framed the way we think around art, education and disability, and that is evident in the present moment. Recent austerity measures in the UK, born out of late capitalist neoliberal politics that have had a significant negative impact on the lives of disabled people, have also gone to work on art education via the English Baccalaureate, or EBAC. And for people who maybe are less familiar with that, that's the prioritisation in schools, where schools have to account for the results of their pupils, and they're required to study STEM, so the science subjects, and there's a reduction in the uptake of creative arts subjects because schools are not persuaded to encourage pupils to engage with those studies. The arts are designated less productive subjects in this context. The echoes of neoliberalism, evident in the politics of disablement, then pervade this context of art education. Of the three ideas here, education then becomes a problematic set of structures. And on the slide, I'm attempting to illustrate this idea of education as this huge set of concepts and ideas, regulations, ways of framing the way we think about learning. So I'm not thinking about learning, I'm thinking about these educational structures that are actually pushing art and disability to the edge, hence the naming of this particular section, subjects on the edge. So of the three ideas here, education emerges as a problematic idea that creates art and disability as subjects on the edge. The current context for disability in education, the current context of special educational needs in particular, is difficult at the moment, to say the least. The Department for Education statistics in January 2019 revealed an increase in young people with so-called special educational needs, with 8,000 children outside education and an increasing number being off-rolled. And this again is a system where schools can remove certain pupils from their number in order to artificially inflate or report on pupil achievement. And there's been a significant increase in that activity over the last 12 months, 2 years. This current context then appears hostile for disabled children and young people. This is the politics of disablement at work, where philosophical arguments about the type of art education received become irrelevant. How can art education learn from body minds when they are not present? Part 5. So this is to conclude and to think about disability futurity and art education. And I'm going to offer 2 possibilities, but of course there are more, and it's always problematic in being offered as a simplistic binary. But we have to remember then Berardi's question. Why is it, among all possibilities of development, one of them prevails? Why is it, amongst all possibilities, that we have a situation currently where a significant number of pupils are outside of education, when there were a range of possibilities that were open to us? I'm going to start, so I thought, should I start with a dystopian or utopian? I think we'll end on a high, and we'll end with the utopian view. So if you just bear with me while I go down. Oh, sorry. Thanks. I was getting carried away now, getting away from the camera. So we're into our dystopian future. There's a continued dominance here of a very limited concept of education that prioritises particular types of ability and productivity over others. The education sector in this dystopian future is further fragmented, with increasing demand for specific segregated provision for body minds that are beyond the limited concept of education fostered by a system of mainstream education that is emerging as being damaging and hostile. And in this dystopian future, we recognise that that environment is damaging and hostile to teachers as well as to pupils. Definitions of ability in art education continue to reinforce an idea that creative practice is for a select few, freeing the rest of us to become active consumers of diminishing resources. Why would we want to waste our time making things? We've been convinced in this dystopian future that we're no good at art, we can't function in those creative ways, and we're freed up to become consumers of diminishing resources. We're rendered uncreative, unable to make and respond, and our time can then be spent serving the machinery of capitalism as consumers of all and makers of nought. And that's a bit of Lancashire dialect. There are hard distinctions between who is defined as an artist and who is not. All hail the cry, I can't draw. Art market reinforces and commodifies practice, which is preserved as an elite occupation. We choose not to make stuff because ability in art is defined along limited and limiting aesthetic principles. Art education drags its anachronistic practices with it into this future. Assessment regimes configure art practice into a distinct and irrelevant school activity. As Gert Biester warns, art education loses its capacity to be art and to be education. The arts lose their creative case for diversity. Somewhere in Liverpool, an art teacher works with a scale from 1 to 9. She marks a child's drawing 1+. But other possibilities prevail. There are some good vibrations in a utopian future where art is recognised for its intrinsic educational capacity and frees itself from the productive and oppressive machinery of education. Art is acknowledged as a way of being that values the centrality of experience, our experiences of being in the world, in whatever forms that takes, inclusive of and learning from diverse experience and representation. Art is open to and with the other. The thoughts of Tobin Sievers continue to inform our practice in this utopian future, with an acceptance of disability that enriches and complicates notions of the aesthetic. We spend more time making and less time questioning the value of what we make. We are concerned with art as a powerful bridge between our individual and social lives. Art offers powerful points of recognition between one and an other. In our present, though, we are always stepping into our future. So Berardi talking about and now, and now, and now. So we're stepping into that future. We recognise then that this utopia offers in small points of resistance when an art teacher questions a definition of ability that conflicts with her philosophy of art and her openness to enriched and complicated notions of an aesthetic. In this utopian futurity, somewhere in an art room in a school in Liverpool, she says, "I love this drawing. It's a 1+. It goes to 9. I think it goes to 11. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, folks. Well, as I promised you, that was an excellent engagement with the topic of disability futurity, where we got Claire to really engage with her own particular interests in art education and obviously disability studies. So we, there's, as I say, a really rich engagement there. We've got a little bit of time now that we can have questions and comments. So let's see how we can work this. And if I can ask on both sides of whether we're at Carlton or at Liverpool Hope, if you can indicate who you are before you ask a question. Perhaps indicate that you want to ask a question by shouting your name. Let's see how that works. So has anyone got a question? Just shout your name either side of the Atlantic, if that's right.
I'll start, David.
Okay, so this is Anna Bay at Liverpool Hope.
Thanks. Thanks so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. Obviously, personally, I really, when I say this, I really identify with the theory and the practice of what you said as someone who needs artistic practice but wouldn't be classified as someone who is able to do, drawing and that. So that really touched me on a personal level. I really appreciate you, talking in depth about those aspects, because I think that they have a bearing on you as a person. So they're part of this system that you described so well, but then they have a bearing on you as a student who, is evaluated in a certain way with the one, as you said. But my question is more about something you said at the start, because you talked about the perils of making judgments about the past from the lens of the present. And I think that goes through your talk in a way, because you're really connecting the past, the present, and the future. But I think that this is a real issue for disability studies in general, you know, like how we look at the past and are able to, you know, understand how the past was through our lens of today. But at the same time, part of the problem with being too wary of that perhaps is that, you know, the past does continue into the future unless we're able to provide another angle. So how do you see these two things working together?
I'm just going to come forward to converse the mic. Is that okay? Sorry. So thinking about...
Yeah. Could you repeat the question?
Okay. So Anna is asked, this is good practice, isn't it? Okay, so Anna was talking about some of the tensions of acknowledging that if we're looking at history, thinking about history, how can we attend to that without being, we need to attend to histories, but without ignoring the context, so at the specific context. How do we then work with this notion of history without then, and Anna was suggesting that there's a problem with history repeating itself, that we can't, some of those ideas we can't shake off. And I think that's why it is really, really important to explore those histories in a very rounded way. So, for example, being able to critique, you know, when we have an acceptance that there are particular established histories, is to try to go beyond those texts to different forms of testimony, different, maybe looking at places where those things aren't. And I'm just reminded of Andrea Levy, who wrote Small Island, who died recently, and she was talking about her construction of a narrative around slave trade. And talking about the fact that those stories weren't necessarily there. She had to look in where the spaces were around that. So I think working with archives, certainly we've got National Archive for Art Education, which is framed around particular headings, but I'm not sure that yet has been explored through a lens of disability studies. So sometimes it is bringing those contemporary perspectives, bringing those to bear on the history, and always attending. I think the idea would be always attending to and being conscious of where we're situated. Again, I could go on. I mean, there's lots of work, for example, around eugenics, which would be an example of Virginia Woolf, for example, being vilified because of her particular beliefs and values that she expounded around eugenics. But again, a rounded reading of Virginia Woolf's life is not to excuse that, but to take account of why that was positioned in that place at that time. And then we would move to a place where we would explore that fully, taking account of those. I'm not quite sure I've addressed your question, Anna, but I've spoken a lot. So that sometimes works.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Anna. Any more questions? Or, as I say, comments?
Ryan?
Okay, so that's Dr. Ryan Patterson at Carleton.
Hi, Dr. Penketh, thank you very much again. I'm taking your, I want to say challenge, but I suppose is a nicer way to say, taking your, I'll say challenge because I can't think of a better word, to see the utopian in a potentially dystopia. I mean, it's so easy as educators to look at education and only see the negative, but I'm really inspired by your attempt to see the positive side. I wonder, I'm really interested in your work on ocular normativity and the inherent ableism that can come with certain art forms simply by the way they are produced and consumed. Recognizing, though, that high art is economically and therefore often physically and cognitively ableist, is there in art education some hope that the art appreciation rather than art production, this is going outside your talk certainly, but I'm just interested in your thoughts, that teaching, let's say, students art appreciation separate from art production actually allows engagement without the requirement of production? I mean, to be obviously a painting, that's an ocular normative thing, but take a sculpture, you can study sculpture without being able necessarily to, the majority of students can't produce high art, and I completely appreciate your point that that is a problem. I'm sorry, I've gone down a well there. I guess what I'm asking is I know art appreciation has been cut from education just as much. Is there a hope in art appreciation separate from production to approach it with a less able normative bent, or is that too built in?
No, I mean, obviously, I don't know enough about your background to know, but within the UK, for example, the area around appreciation, art history, was brought into art making. So ideas that students would be engaging with their practice, but also that would be informed by them developing knowledge and awareness of, for example, historical ideas around art and the appreciation of art. More recently, there's been a lot of work done by the Art History Association to reintroduce art history courses, because that's as an area that's had massive decline over here, and I don't know if that's the same for you.
Yeah, the trend is similar.
Well, I think in some respects there can be a problematic distinction. I think probably some of the underlying ideas in terms of ableism, I think that's a shared territory across ideas around appreciation and making. I think it shares that heritage, and I think it is problematic to separate those two things out. Not least because obviously the idea about engaging and working with and understanding the work of others, often we prioritise literacy-based approaches for that, but that can be done through material forms. And I think probably using material forms for developing understanding. Actually, this presentation is a case in point. I've explored a lot of these ideas, but through the making process, through painting, through drawing, making things, and the outcome has to be in words. But sometimes there's elements where we're working across appreciation and making, but we can still do appreciation through the making process. But I don't know if that makes any sense. I don't think just working with appreciation is a leveler. If people's ultimate conception that there's particular people who can work in particular ways and others can't, I think that would then be brought to bear on art appreciation courses. I think that.
Thanks, Darren. Thanks, Ryan. Anyone else out the side?
Yes, Brittany, Research Administrator, Technical Advisor, Carleton University's Disabilities Research Group. So the idea of the politics of ableism, would you say that is a thing right now that is exclusive to, or not exclusive to, but happening, yeah, I guess exclusively in England? Because I know that right now, under our federal government, we do have a lot of laws that are changing and making things more accessible.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting when we're taking this, taking a historical perspective, enables you to actually recognise that where there are real developments, But one of the things I think, you know, and actually in terms of legislation, in terms of access, we can see that there are real advances, I think, across society and also in education. One thing that I would just warn against is, though, that we maybe see that as this sort of progressive, through the lens of that progressive modernist sort of trajectory where everything's always getting better. And actually, I think we do have to accept, particularly, I would say at the moment with our own education system, that although we've got legislation in place, the reality is that we've got increasing numbers of children who are not in education at the moment. And that's been recognised by the Department for Education recently. They made an announcement that they're going to create, they've got a bid out for the creation of, I can't remember exactly how many, but a significant number of special schools as free schools. And there's a number of directives that are going out in response to what's seemed to be sort of a decline in terms of the quality. So I would appreciate, yes, I think on the first part that you were saying, actually this isn't restricted to the context in England. I was trying to offer a very specific context for this talk. I think all of these things could be broadened in terms of the international context. And I would say that there are advances, but I think we have to be cautious about the narrative of progression in that way, because I think, you know, if we're not mindful that there are still issues, and I think that ableist tendency in education particularly is a very dangerous one.
Thank you, Claire. And any more questions or comments either side?
Doris?
Yes, well remembered. Right, I'm Doris.
Yes, go on.
Doris Ward from the Creative Campus in Liverpool Health University. I teach undergraduates in fine art and creative teach.
Excellent.
History.
Can I just say one thing? Just on this occasion, can I ask you to keep your question quite short?
Yeah.
If you've got a few, that's fine, but let's do them one at a time because Claire's going to be translating, as it were, to the audience. So just bear with me.
It's fine. No, I just wanted to point something out which I find perhaps worth mentioning. There are sort of several contradictions and ironies now, I think, which have occurred at the higher education level. On one hand, we seem to be increasingly recruiting students who have, for want of a better word, disabilities, so in particular mental health, and they're highly represented, I think, on our fine art and related design courses. On the other hand, we have still an ongoing exclusion and the prominence of visual discourse, which is simultaneously questioned by students engaging with the critical discourse, which questions this, like Martin Jay, for instance. So I just wanted to sort of throw that in as a kind of an observation for you to comment on that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doris. And sorry, Claire, but can you
repeat
translate
it?
Yeah.
So Doris was suggesting that we've got an increase of students with mental health impairment, but also then maybe students who are being encouraged to challenge ideas such as oculocentrism. So through the curriculum, they're engaging with those critical debates. And at the same time, we've got an increase to some extent in a diverse student body. Doris, is that? But maybe not in other areas. You're suggesting that there's an increased diversity in some areas, but not across range of impairments, for example. Yeah. Yeah, and I noted actually, I was external examiner at an art school. I won't mention it actually, but a beautiful building, and people suggesting that, you know, that we were going to a meeting up a spiral staircase, and the entrance to the art school's full of steps. The entrance for wheelchair users is still at the back by the bins. And when I was asking about what about your students, you know, what about access requirements? Oh, we don't have anybody who uses a wheelchair. It's like, well, you know, because there are issues in terms of basic level of access around some of that accommodation. I think in terms of the curriculum, though, I think it's Yeah, it is one to watch, because obviously in higher education, we're only really now starting to see the impact of the reduction of the curriculum in secondary schools. Obviously, my concern is around a secondary art curriculum, but it's very, very likely that there will be a big hit in terms of recruitment, in terms of people going on to study in higher education from across the board. I think also that that idea in terms of thinking about ocular normativity within the curriculum, we know, for example, that there's been a lot of work done in art education research around the development of contemporary art practice. So work that would be able to enable people to respond in a range of different media, in a range of sensory ways of exploring ideas. But there's still a battle within school education about how contemporary art practices can really impact and be embedded within art education practice, which is my reference to the anachronistic practices where people are still working with traditions that in terms of the fine art world are starting to be outmoded. So there are tensions, contradictions, and yeah. Thank you for your question, though, Doris.
Thanks, Doris. And Doris, I'll just say as well, thanks for joining us, because one of the issues we've had over the years, I mean, the centre is in its 10th year now, which is great, but one of the faults is that we've had trouble, if you like, being cross-faculty, or as cross-faculty as we want to be. And just for the benefit of Colton, Doris is from another faculty, as it were, at Liverpool Hope. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
You said
yes,
all that. Yeah, different campus as well, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
All the better, so thank you. Any more questions or comments? We haven't got too much time left, but we have got a little.
I've got one. My name is Dominique Marshall. I'm part of the Disability Research Group here. I'm a historian. Thank you very much for your connections between the past and the future. They were very rich. I wanted to ask you how much of what you're doing now has made, however little it is, its way on the utopian side of things, has made its way to Teachers College. Like, are there any place around you where actually what you're saying now informs how you teach teacher to teach students?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think reading the dystopian and the utopian futures are actually, as I was saying, they are based in the present. So I would argue, I was external examiner at the Institute of Education with their PGCE students, who they have about 50 students each year, and we've been able to engage with ideas from disability studies in their work, in their practice. One of the things I think that's interesting is going to a session of maybe with 50 postgraduate students, some are mature students, people who've been around and in education for a long time, asking people whether they had heard of the social model of disability. In a room of 50, for the last 2 years, there were one person out of 50 people who'd actually heard of the social model of disability. And I think that was, although people, they received that very warmly because it's such a great idea. So there's so much potential for people to work with those ideas. And I think that it's difficult to talk about art educators as this sort of holistic sort of group, because it's so diverse, people coming from design, craft backgrounds, just a range of different backgrounds. And I think those different disciplines maybe impact on how people are able to engage. One of the biggest issues, though, in terms of people being able to take practice, so being able to share Tobin Sieber's work, for example, around this idea about aesthetic and contesting the ideas around aesthetic, is that some of those students have very, very limited access to diversity in terms of the classrooms that they're engaging with, particularly in relation to disability. And that was reported, this is anecdotal, but this was reported in a number of sessions where I was talking about disability studies and the potential gains of bringing disability arts, for example, into the classroom, is that the students felt that in some cases had limited relevance. So we have got a little bit of a situation of the chicken and the egg where people don't attend to that because they're not working with diverse groups potentially. So encouraging people to work, and I think that's, you know, the work there that we can engage with through disability arts has got tremendous potential. And, you know, art teachers would engage with that, but it is getting the stuff out there.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dominic. Can I just say we've got a question here at Liverpool Hope University from Dr. Ria Cheen.
Yes, that would be better. Right, this is Ria Cheen, Liverpool Hope. So in a similar vein to last question, I was wondering about how really what's out there for the art teacher who kind of wants to try and change their practice, or the person training to be an art teacher. And, you know, utopia, you know, by definition, that's no place. It's a place that doesn't exist, if I'm remembering it right. So what's out there to help us turn it into some place to get towards that kind of a future?
Okay, thank you. I'd point to work actually in the States by Alice Wexler. Doug Blandy was doing work where he was bringing disability studies to art education, actually as far back as the 90s, but people like John Darby, Alice Wexler, other people who are writing and giving examples of bringing disability studies to art education. So I would argue that there are far more examples where people are bringing that work. I wouldn't put myself in that category, but certainly I've done and published work where I've been trying to share models, for example, using Cripps theory with art practitioners. So there are now examples of that. And I think, you know, in terms of that, the ability for people to learn through and with these ideas is very evident. I would only say that there's a word of caution there, because we still have the publication of books like How to Teach Art to Children with Special Educational Needs, which would then list you know, a range of impairments and think about that separation. I'm not probably making a good case for this, but there's something problematic in the way that art education might be conceptualized when we've got books that are sort of like how-to guides for special education. That's doing something very, very different. And the trend, one of the trends in art education has been to move towards critical social theory. And I think having that idea about using critical social theory but bringing disability in, so when our art educators are talking about feminism, they're talking about ideas around race, sexuality, that disability needs to be brought into that same conversation, and it needs to be engaged with in the same political way. And I think the issue around the special educational needs handbooks are that it looks as if it's a depoliticized space, when actually we know it's highly political. So I would just caution about work in disability studies is alongside still that the dominant discourse for educators, which is framing disability within that discourse of special education.
I suppose I was wondering in particular about what there might be out there that's not in academic journals, what there might be for like the busy teacher.
Yeah, well, there are actually, and again, this as part of the work for the National Society for Education, Art and Design, they have some really vibrant networks. So there's NEATN, which is the North East Art Teachers Education Network. And they've run workshops that I've participated in. But also the NSCAD, as well as having IJADE academic journal, they also have something called AD, which is a practitioners magazine, and they featured actually an article around a colleague, Sandra Hyatt here, who did work at St Vincent's, where she was working with PGC students, with students who have visual impairment. So there are a range of different ways of accessing those ideas. And again, I would suggest that there's a greater range of examples now of work in disability studies.
Okay, we are more or less out of time, but I think all things considered, if there's another question perhaps from Carlton, we could round off with that one, if there's a comment or question from Carlton.
No, Brittany has another one.
Okay.
So when you say that there's a lot of, or there's, how do I word this? So is there sort of a reticence to adapt to fields other than ocular normativity in art education?
Well, I can certainly talk about the tradition here is that we have a system of examination that still does prioritise certain modes. Again, there's work that was published as early as the 1980s by somebody called Arthur Hughes, where he talked about the anachronistic practices, which I think relates to this idea about people doing standard drawings of still life objects placed on a table. And that's the issue there being that it's only one set of practices that are occurring. So I think I would say that within compulsory education, that there is still that emphasis around ocular centricity, and I would argue that that does shift to ocular normativity because of that idea about people maybe again, anecdotal examples, but pupils with visual impairment being told actually art education isn't relevant for you, so don't continue to A-level, or why would you do colour theory? Why would you do colour theory if you have a visual impairment? But that sense, but I'm talking very, very anecdotally. But I would say that of course, when we're working with exam systems, we're working with examples of work. So we have this constant overlaying of examples of practice that confirm particular ideas around art practice.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me just again thank everyone who's joined us here at Liverpool Hope University, and indeed everyone who's joined us via Carleton University. That's been really nice discussions all round, more engagement than we normally have, which is all credit to Claire's work for stimulating that. So, as I say, thanks to everyone who's joined us today. I hope you can come to the next one, which is in June. Then we have another event in September along the same lines, and of course along the way we have the conference, which is a separate matter. So if I can just ask everyone to just show our appreciation to Dr. Claire Penker.
Okay, and thank you from Carleton. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.